Short answer, yes. Long answer, well, let's just watch the rest of this video. First of all, I want to apologize for this video's length. I wish it could be shorter, but this is a complex topic with many points needed to be discussed to understand both all the evidence and to gain a scientific mindset when approaching this topic. Oh man, yes, this is it. This is the video. I know a ton of people have been hoping for it, and others have been dreading my 100,000 subscriber video, which I've been putting off for like a year now. Jeez. And let me get something straight with all you guys. I'm making this video not because I'm a sadistic wet towel that wants to ruin your childhood, but because I want to dispel and clean up all the misinformation and just give you guys the truth and science and all of this stuff. If you haven't noticed, in some of my other videos, I claim to love feathered dinosaurs and all that. And I just want you guys to understand that this is just an over-exaggeration of my character. Sure, I think feathered dinosaurs are very cool, but going into this video, I will always value accuracy and evidence above all else in my videos. I will not be biased towards the subject whatsoever. In the end, it really doesn't matter what you or I think of what T-Rex's skin coverings were like. In the end, all that matters is the evidence and the accuracy, and that's what this video's main primary purpose is, to present unbiased evidence and truth, not to discuss if T-Rex looks gay with feathers. Okay, now that we got that out of the way, let's proceed. Alright, the integument or skin covering of almost all fossil organisms has been a mystery ever since the first bones were dug up, and in particular, the integument of large tyrannosaurs is certainly a hot topic in pop culture and media. For some reason, this animal in particular, an annoying phenomena has appeared, and it's people being stubborn with T-Rex's skin coverings based on the scientific evidence. In no other area of paleontological discussions will you find more misinformation, myths, and bias than in the integument of T-Rex.
We must be cautious.
That's right, Obi-Wan Kenobi. Holy shit. So this video will exist to clean up this area of science by presenting all the latest evidence, accurate information, and scientific opinion on the subject. Once again, I want to thank Nick and Tom from Saurian, two really big paleo nerds that have really accumulated a bunch of this evidence and really helped me with the research in this video. FYI, this video couldn't exist without their help. Please go and support the awesome video game Saurian and their dev team. They are probably the most helpful and nicest guys I know. I also want to personally thank the DeviantArt user Paleop for creating and allowing me to use these awesome silhouettes of various theropods. Make sure you check out his DeviantArt page in the link in the description. All you guys are awesome. Alrighty, this video will talk about copious amounts of studies, fossils, and information, and therefore will be broken up into bits. I will first discuss the types of skin coverings exhibited in dinosaurs, then talk about the basics of phylogenetics and ancestral traits, the actual evidence, disprove popular myths, and then give you guys an accurate consensus on the subject solely based on the evidence and scientific opinion. Finally, all sources can be found in the description, and I would advise all of you to check out the evidence for yourself and not just take my word for it. Okay, we got a lot to talk about, so let's just get straight to it. Now, before we get into the direct evidence on T-Rex and its relatives, let's just talk about what type of skin coverings dinosaurs had, so that we can get a good understanding of what we are looking for. This part will be a more revised version of my Which Dinosaurs Had Feathers video. All dinosaurs, including birds, had and still have various amounts of skin coverings, but when we get down to it, they can be broken down into three main parts: scales, feathers, and bare skin. Yes, birds have scales, also known as scutes or reticula. These scales are often present in the foot or toe regions and are indeed homologous to the scales exhibited in extinct dinosaurs. It is also important to note that feathers are actually scales themselves, just a highly diverged type. Crocodilian scales and dinosaur feathers and even pterosaur pygnofibers, hair-like filaments exhibited in pterosaurs, all evolved from the same common skin covering. Now, it is also important to note that there is a difference between archosaur scales and something like lizard scales. It was once thought that feathers and scales are made up of two distinct forms of keratin, a protein responsible for the development of all skin coverings from hair to horns to scales, and that each type of keratin was exclusive to each skin structure, feathers and scales. However, in 2006, a study discovered the presence of feather keratin in early stages of the development of American alligator scales. This proved that the keratin used to develop feathers is present in early stages of crocodilians. This form of keratin is not exhibited in mature forms. These embryonic feathers seen in alligators, one of the closest living relatives to dinosaurs, not only prove the common close ancestry of crocodilians and dinosaurs, but also shows us that dinosaur scales were much different than lizard scales and were more like feathers. Also, this study basically proved that feathers were not only ancestral to dinosaurs, but even further back in Archosauria. Bare skin exists under feathers and scales. This is why lizards and birds with skin conditions that cause the lack of development of these proteins will look like naked mole rats. Same thing when birds molt and lose their feathers, such as vultures or ostriches. When these organisms lose their feathers or scales, neither scales nor feathers exist under them, only bare scaleless skin. Bare skin will often have attachment points for feathers and scales. A popular myth I have come across is the idea that all three of these are mutually exclusive, i.e. scales cannot exist alongside feathers, feathers cannot exist alongside scales, bare skin cannot exist alongside scales, etc. This is actually very untrue. In reality, all three can exist simultaneously on various parts of the same organism. All modern birds have feathers, scales, and bare scaleless skin areas. Just look at the ostrich, vulture, eagle, and basically all other birds. There are examples of the coexistence of feathers with the other skin coverings in fossil dinosaurs as well. Juaverator, Calindrodromaeus, Ornithomimus in 2015, and Conquavenator. In reality, basically all modern birds have feathered sections, scale sections, and scaleless skin, such as the ostrich. Feathers and scales, for instance, can exist between each other, such is the case with Juaverator and some owls. Frickin' owls again, how many times am I going to bring? One important thing to note, when a bird molts, or in other words loses its feathers, scales won't replace them, because simply put, feathers are scales. So when people say baby T.rexes had feathers, but adults are somehow fully scaly because the feathers molt, that is impossible and untrue. Scales cannot exist under feathers, only next to them. That is exactly why chickens, when they lose their feathers, don't look like lizards, they just have naked skin underneath them. So in other words, feathers, scales, and naked skin can all coexist on the same organism, but feathers and scales cannot exist under one another. Only bare skin can exist under feathers and scales. Feathers and scales cannot exist under one another, but they can exist between and next to each other. Phew, that was a mouthful. Now, let's break down feathers even further. There are multiple types of feathers in all dinosaurs, and it can get really confusing, but there is hope. They can be separated into stages. This will be following the Prum model in 1999. Stage 1 feathers, such as those found in Paleosaurus, are unbranching hollow cylinders that can form tube-like, for lack of a better word, quills. These feathers are hollow and would be kinda hard for us to fit into our modern definition of feather. Stage 2 feathers are what we'd like to call downy feathers, and consist of many filaments extending from a single base. They would appear a little bit like dandelion heads. Stage 3 feathers have a central shaft with barbs, but lack the barbules and hooklets that give more advanced feathers their solid aerodynamic shape. This type of feather can be seen today on the modern ratites, emus, and ostriches, and elephant birds, etc. These types of feathers would look a bit like pine needle tree branches. Stage 4 and 5 feathers are where the more advanced feathers come in, having a central shaft with barbules and hooklets, such as pennaceous feathers. These type of feathers are seen in maniraptors, such as birds and raptors, and are more aerodynamic. And well, that's about it. There are more specific types of these feathers that can be broken down into further groups, but I think you guys understand the basics of dinosaur integument. Let's move on to our next section. Now here I'll explain the basics of biology and paleontology to the people who don't know it. An ancestral trait, in lamest terms, is a trait originally present in the ancestor of a group. Feathers are an ancestral trait to all dinosaurs, in the same way fur is ancestral to all mammals. Calindrodromaeus, in 2014, has confirmed this. The important thing to note here is that ancestral traits stay with its members for tens of millions of years, and almost are never entirely lost even when they serve no purpose, especially skin coverings. Let's give an excellent example: mammalian fur in cetaceans. As said before, hair is an ancestral trait covering to all mammals. In the same way, feathers are ancestral to all dinosaurs. Cetaceans, also known as all whales and dolphins, broke off from their common ancestor with the furry, hair-covered land mammals 55 million years ago, just 10 million years less than how long it's been since the Mesozoic. Yet, even after all that time, after all that evolution, hair, an ancestral trait to all mammals, has stayed with them. Yes, believe it or not, all cetaceans, just like all mammals, possess hair. Dolphins, for example, are born with a few stray hairs poking out of their facial region like a mustache. Soon after birth, these hairs will fall out, and all you will be able to see are hair follicles, which are tiny pits where the hair used to grow out of. Larger whales, such as the humpback, on the other hand, have hair that stays with them for their entire lives. Humpback whales have distinct bumps on their lower and upper jaw, from which tiny hairs protrude. These hairs actually help humpback whales to sense things in their environment. Now, this example doesn't entirely apply to T.rex and other dinosaurs. T.rex is nowhere as diverged as dolphins and whales. Dolphins and whales are a rather extreme case, and feathers and hair aren't exactly that similar in function, structure, etc. It has even been suggested that the scales in modern-day birds are actually feathers that reverted back to being scales. But this was just to show you how ancestral traits work, and just to show you how ancestral traits will stay with an organism. Ancestral traits such as skin coverings are very deeply engraved in its members, and you need evidence to say that a member didn't have them. Even after all this progression, 55 million years worth of it, their ancestral skin covering has stayed with them. And it's been well over 80 million years for all birds, and guess what? Not one of them has completely lost their ancestral feathers. So when somebody tells you T-Rex lost its ancestral skin covering of feathers entirely in less than 10 million years from its common feathered ancestor, just remember cetaceans and birds have retained their ancestral skin covering over 5 times that long, and cetaceans did in conditions where it's almost entirely useless. From what mammals, birds, and lizards, and many other animals tell us, more often than not, a descendant will possess the same skin covering as its ancestor. It is extremely unlikely for an organism to completely abandon its ancestral skin covering in such a short amount of time, and evolution. And that brings me to my next important thing to talk about in this section, explaining phylogenetics. Phylogenetics is the single most important thing in all paleontology. Phylogenetics is best put as when there is insufficient evidence to directly know the traits of an organism, we look at the organism's closest relatives for answers. When we are lacking on information on a particular species, we use its relatives to fill in the places. This process is known as phylogenetic bracketing, and I think it's best put by my colleague Steven from Your Dinosaurs Are Wrong, link in the description. So in phylogenetics and science in general, when we don't have the direct evidence of skin coverings of T.rex, we use phylogenetic bracketing by looking to its relatives, and what they tell us is the most logical scientific answer, until we have direct evidence to say otherwise. This concept is an extremely important one to comprehend. In science, always follow what the direct evidence from close relatives gives us above all else. So if T-Rex's ancestors tell us it had feathers, that means T-Rex had feathers, until we have direct evidence to tell us otherwise. Simple as that. The method of phylogenetics is how paleontology has always functioned. Just because the Dakotaraptor specimen lacked a head doesn't mean it didn't have one. We use phylogenetics to tell us how it looked, and until further evidence, that is how it looked. Science does not function like this. Because no feathers were found, it didn't have feathers. In science, we always take the most likely and logical conclusion above the complex and illogical ones. We use relatives to give us the most reasonable answer, and until we find evidence otherwise, that is the answer. So even if T-Rex doesn't have direct evidence it was feathered, that doesn't mean it didn't have them. Using phylogenetics, we can come to the most logical conclusion based on the evidence at hand. And that is our next section. So in this section, and the rest of the video, keep in mind these concepts of phylogenetics and ancestral traits. They will be crucial into yielding the most scientific and logical answer. Okay then. Now, let's get down to the evidence. Here we will discuss the direct evidence of what skin covering T-Rex and its relatives had. In reality, we know very little about theropod skin coverings. We simply lack a large amount of skin impressions from various members of Theropoda, much unlike Ornithopoda and Sauropods. Take for instance the fact we have absolutely no idea what skin covering Spinosaurs had at all. Sure, we have a large amount of evidence of skin coverings from Silurosauria, but outside that, theropods are a bit of an unknown. Nevertheless, we have a sizable amount of fossils preserving skin impressions. It should be also noted that several of these impressions haven't been photographed, haven't been published, and are only known from interviews in a few books. T-Rex. Let's start out with all the direct evidence of integument preservation in just T-Rex. Basically, everything we know about T-Rex skin covering, if it be scaly, feathered, or just plain old bare skin, comes from phylogenetics of relatives of T-Rex. In reality, we know very little about the skin covering of T-Rex in particular. And aside from foot impressions, which were scaly and ostrich-like, a common trait among all dinosaurs, even birds, all we do know of the actual body of T-Rex comes from one individual, Y-Rex. One of the smallest of all of them, and from that one individual, all that was found of its skin covering was a small patch of scaly bumps from the underside of the tail region. That is smaller than a coin. Yup, that's all we know. I should add, this skin patch remains unpublished during the writing of the script, and I believe only 2 or 3 images exist of this patch online. The bumps themselves are 1 to 2 millimeters wide and are described as very small. Paul Serrano mentions that he has the specimen in his lab, and that it lacks true scales, and suggests that this area could have bore feathers in life. It is interesting also to note how some of these scales look compared to the reticula or bird scales on the legs of an emu. Let me remind you, this skin patch is smaller than a coin, on an animal that it was 40 feet long. Not only does this tell us very little about the rest of the organism, but it's not at all uncharacteristic of dinosaurs to have scales on this section of the body. Duovierator, Calindrodromaeus, and Concavenator all have feathered areas, yet scaly tails and feet. It's actually quite common to find this area of the body to be featherless in theropods. Various theropods possessing scaly tails and scaly feet have been discovered, yet still possessing feathered midsections, arms, necks, and other parts of the body. The underside of the tail is a known area for where scales are normally present in dinosaurs, and the evidence of scales on T-rex is not at all surprising and definitely doesn't tell us much about the rest of the body at all. Both the feet and tail are known scaly regions in many dinosaurs that still possess feathered bodies. To base the rest of the organism off this tiny, small sections is like saying this animal was entirely scaly just on foot impressions. Again, an extreme case to just prove my point. Or just look at the featherless sections of an ostrich. There is also another claim that another skin impression of T-rex exists, an undescribed palm-sized patch found with a rib showing bird-like naked skin likened to plucked chicken or elephant hide. Again, this section may suggest T-rex was similar to an ostrich, possessing feathers in this area as a juvenile and then molting them, revealing a featherless skin patch. Ostriches, for instance, have large sections of this on their bodies, and based on this alone, one could think that the entire animal was scaly like this, but nope. So, looking at all the direct evidence alone, there isn't a lot to go on. All we know about T-rex is that it had scaly feet and a scaly underside of the tail, which basically tells us what we already knew. Rex possibly also had feathers on its rib and underside of the tail, which was later lost, revealing only bare skin, similar to a modern ostrich. It should also be added that these scale impressions from the tail section could have had feathers between them in life, as proposed by Serrano, similar to related feather dinos. So to put things straight, the direct evidence of T-rex at the time of this video's publishing is unclear. We really need other relatives to get an idea because we really have very little based on Rex alone. Moving on to other Tyrannosaurs, most other Tyrannosaurs don't help us much because, simply put, nothing has preserved. Conditions ripe for preservation, especially feathers, is incredibly rare and only happens in select places. Tarbosaurus is probably the closest of these relatives in size and relativity to Rex. Skin impressions showing reticula in a footprint was assigned to Tarbosaurus, and a small patch of domed tubercles on the specimen too damaged to know the locality of the impression also exist. The most interesting thing about Tarbo is an undescribed naked skin from a badly withered skull formed a, I quote, waddle or bag of skin under the throat. This possibly suggests Tarbo and possibly other related tyrannosaurs possessed a throat pouch of skin similar to that of modern birds. Very interesting indeed. So Tarbo, based on evidence alone, possibly had a bag-like skin organ under its neck, scales on its feet, and possibly scales or scaleless skin elsewhere. Again, like T-rex and several other theropods, there isn't much to go on here. Moving on to another large tyrannosaur, Gorgosaurus. An impression from an unknown area on the body possessed, I quote, smooth, naked skin lacking the scales on other dinosaurs, and is described as similar to featherless skin found in large modern birds, such as ostriches. Interesting. An impression has also been described from the tail with, I quote, small, rounded, or hexagonal scales. So, from Gorgosaurus, we know it had scaleless naked skin, possibly similar to an ostrich's, and a scaly tail. See a common theme here? Albertosaurus also had a scaleless skin area in the tail region of its body, as well as skin impressions currently under study. These skin impressions are possibly similar to the skin impressions of Displatosaurus. Displatosaurus has an impression roughly the size of a Canadian dollar coin, found on a large specimen. The impressions show reticula, or scales, described as remarkably similar to those of Tarbosaurus. Where on the body they were found is not mentioned. D-long, a small primitive tyrannosaur, possessed simple, stage 2 branching feathers on at least the tail section, both dorsal and ventral, and the lower jaw. And finally, we get to Eutyrannus, a massive 30-foot-long tyrannosaur from China, which possessed basically a full body covering of feathers. Feathers are found on the back of the neck, along the posterior part of the tail, near the hips, a fragment that's what's probably the humerus, and feathers on the metatarsals. So it's likely feathers extended at least as far as the ankle joint. Yes, even its feet were feathered, maybe even the toes. Based on this distribution, it's pretty safe to assume that the feathers covered pretty much the entire body. The feathers are shaggy and rat-like, very long, with the main body feathers averaging 15 centimeters in length. Those on the arm are 16 centimeters in length, and those on the neck are over 20 centimeters in length, meaning its feathers were super long and shaggy and would make the whole animal look relatively fluffy looking. These feathers were even extended to at least the dinosaur's feet. The published scientific paper is rather vague. These feathers are stage 2 and stage 3 feathers. Another large tyrannosaur from Laoang, possibly another Eutyrannus, has stage 1 feathers on the tail region. Therefore, Eutyrannus had a mix of quill-like stage 1 feathers with typical protofeather filaments. So, it had a mix between stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3. The feathers were found on multiple specimens varying in age and size, from juvenile to subadult to adult. The largest Eutyrannus was about the size of Jane, a subadult T.rex. Eutyrannus is currently the closest related organism with direct preservation of feathers to T.rex, and several other large tyrannosaurs. I might be leaving out a few small unpublished skin impressions with very little data about them, but this is basically all we have so far with direct evidence of skin coverings and tyrannosaurs. Still, very little. All skin impressions are preserved in areas known to be scaly or bare-skinned in other dinosaurs, even feathered ones, such as the tail and hind limbs. Really, these tiny fragments don't help us to determine the rest of the bodies of these large tyrannosaurs. I do find it rather strange we are almost always lacking in skin impressions from the midsections, arms, and back, and other normally feathered sections of the bodies of various tyrannosaurs. Only the regions known to be scaly are preserved. Almost as if there's something not preserving due to requiring special conditions. I'm just saying, the thing is we really don't have much evidence to suggest tyrannosaurs were extensively scaly. All we have are super small impressions from areas known to be scaly. We actually have more evidence to say they were feathered just based on extensive feathered preservations on Eutyrannus and Delong. Well, what I'm saying is we still need to look at other more distant related groups to get an idea. Now moving on to the Tyrannosaur's closest relatives, Compsognaathids. Compies have multiple direct evidence of feathers, and the entire group was undeniably feathered. Duraverator, a compy, possessed scaleless skin on its sections of its hips and hind limbs, as well as parts of the tail. It also possessed scales on its tail and feathers at least on the top of the tail. These feathers exist between the scales. Sinosauropteryx was extensively feathered with stage 2 downy feathers, basically that covered the entire body, even the tail. The fossil of this guy speaks for itself. And there's other examples of feathers in compies which further proves that they were all feathered, with scaly regions and skin regions. We also have multiple examples of feathered evidences in ornithomimosaurs, such as Ornithomimus. We also have evidence of a naked skin throat pouch in Pelecomimus, possibly similar to that of Tarbo. Ornithomimus in 2015 told us they basically were feathered similar to an ostrich, naked skin on the legs and underside of the tail, and basically everywhere else being feathered. And from there we go to the Maniraptors, which all were undeniably feathered with stage 4 and stage 5 feathers, along with the previous stages. Therizinosaurs like Bipalosaurus also possess similar feathered coverage on the arms, neck, tail, and upper torso. No feathers on the head. The group was undeniably feathered. Oviraptors and Dromaeosaurs, really, I don't need to talk about the evidence in these guys. They're quite notorious, along with modern birds. So all of T-Rex's relatives to the right were feathered. What about the left? Further back in the family tree? Well, let's find out. Outside of Coelurosaura is a bit of an unknown with very few fossilizations. I think the only known theropods with skin impressions are very few and far between, so let's just list them. Further back, the closest primitive relative with fossilization of its skin covering to Tyrannosaurs is Scirrhiomimus. Its specimens preserve feathers at the base of the tail and a small patch of skin, seen as yellow under ultraviolet light here. Currently, it is unclear on what group is closest related to this guy, but either way, it is more primitive than all tyrannosaurs, possibly closer related to megalosaurs and spinosaurs. Yet, still possess feathers. Scirrhiomimus, regardless of its placement, proves that feathers existed before tyrannosaurs even split, further providing proof feathers are a more basal and primitive trait than once thought. Conquavenator is a carnosaur, the same group that includes Allosaurus. Its fossil preserved scaly hind limbs and a scaly tail. The arms of this guy possessed quill knobs. Conquavenator most likely had feathers on its arms, meaning, once again, feathers existed further back. And lastly, my trump card, no, not you, Calendodromaeus, yep, an Orniscian dinosaur which is way far removed from T-Rex, yet possessed stage 2 feathers. This discovery alone proved that feathers were ancestral to all dinosaurs, and feathers are possibly an ancestral trait to both dinosaurs and pterosaurs both. Whew. And the presence of proteins used to create feathers in embryonic crocodilians suggests feathers could have existed way far back. I know this is getting complicated, so all you need to know is that feathers are found both before Tyrannosaurs split and after they split. as well as a few tyrannosaurs themselves having direct evidence they possessed feathers. So therefore, using phylogenetic bracketing, we can easily come to the conclusion T-Rex and all tyrannosaurs, until direct evidence tells us otherwise, were indeed feathered at some point in their lives. The only tiny evidence of scales and bare skin exists in areas known to be scaly in other dinosaurs, such as scaly tails and legs. And the lack thereof evidence of skin impressions from known feathered areas on the bodies of other dinosaurs, absent in tyrannosaurs, also makes me a bit skeptical of to just jump to the conclusion that the whole tyrannosaurs were featherless. And the fact we have way more evidence from close relatives to support they were indeed feathered than entirely scaly. So sure, we have no direct evidence T-Rex had feathers, but the thing is we got zero evidence to disprove T-Rex had feathers either. If we just look at all the evidence of skin coverings and just lay them out in the dinosaur family tree, and then follow phylogenetic bracketing, we can easily come to this inference. So yes, T-Rex had feathers, until direct evidence says otherwise. And because most of what we know about T-Rex are unknowns, with zero evidence, for the time being, science has to fill in this area with the most logical assumption based on the current information. The most logical assumption, based on phylogenetics, is that T-Rex did indeed possess feathers. We have zero evidence to suggest it didn't, and the little evidence we have tends to lean towards this conclusion, not even mentioning the entire family tree of close relatives and ancestors with direct evidence they were feathered. We have way more evidence to support feathers than to support randomly entirely scaly Rex. All evidence sides with all tyrannosaurs possessing feathers as opposed to lacking them. So I guess from here, this video isn't a discussion on if T-Rex had possessed feathers, but more on what type did it possess, and where. The type of feathers most likely exhibited in all tyrannosaurs such as Rex and Tarbosaurus would be, based on the placement of tyrannosaurs on the tree from their close relatives, stage 2 and stage 3 feathers. Once again, stage 2 feathers are what we commonly call down feathers, and consist of many filaments extending from a single base. Stage 3 feathers have a central shaft with barbs, but lack the barbules and hooklets. This type of feather can be seen today on the ratites. T-Rex would possess feathers similar to that of an ostrich, cassowary, emu, kiwi, etc., which all possess stage 3 feathers, probably the closest to that of tyrannosaurs. As for where they would be placed on the body, T-Rex probably had similar skin coverings to an ostrich, having all feathered, scaleless-skinned, and scaled regions. We can infer from skin impressions that Tyrannosaurus didn't have feathers on its tail or feet. As we do not have any preserved feathers on this animal so far, we do not yet know to what extent they existed on the rest of the body. It could have been anything from almost none, only exhibited in juveniles that fell off at a certain age, leaving naked scaleless skin, to an almost completely covering of the torso and limbs, with only the feet and tail bare. So, based solely on phylogenetics, the current accurate skin covering of an adult T-Rex is between almost entirely naked, covered in scaleless bare skin, to almost entirely feathered, with the only featherless regions being the tail and feet. Both are equally accurate based on all the current evidence we know, and everything between these two limits is also accurate until more data is given. But know this, you can most likely kiss your fully scaly T-Rex goodbye, because, regardless, T-Rex and other large tyrannosaurs definitely possessed feathers at one point in their lives. And due to this, even if they lost these feathers when reaching maturity, this would leave scaleless bare skin, not scales. Also, although both extremes are equally accurate, based on most other dinosaur species, it is most likely and most plausible that T-Rex had a balance between the two extremes, possessing a feathered midsection, arms, back and neck and head, and possessed a naked underside, naked and scaly legs, and a scaly tail. Just based on close relatives such as Ornithomimus, which lived in the same environment, this is the most likely and most plausible reconstruction, as multiple dinosaur species have a similar layout. I personally believe the most plausible layout is T-Rex having a skin covering layout similar to an ostrich or Ornithomimus, having a considerable amount of feathers, but still having featherless skin sections on its legs and underside to radiate heat. I know it looks bizarre. I'd say following a similar feather layout to an ostrich and related dinosaurs is a pretty safe bet, and in my opinion the most realistic approach based on the evidence at hand. So for the time being, this is accurate, and this is accurate. Here's just a few possible skin covering layouts on T-Rex. The awesome and great paleo artist James Gurney actually created a few great illustrations for Scientific American depicting various tyrannosaurs with feathers. So, cool. But before you start spreading the news or yell at me at how a feathered T-Rex is impossible, let me clear up a bunch of myths and misconceptions centered around T-Rex and its feathers. Myth number 1. T-Rex is too big for feathers. You won't believe how many times I've heard this myth, and it's entirely baseless. There have been no publications on the body size limit for feathered animals, and considering we have modern dinosaurs like Epyornithids, which were the size of rhinos and hippos and had a large amount of feathers no problem, yeah, that statement really doesn't work. Number 2. Too hot. So hot. This myth is often found alongside myth number 1, as many people claim feathers would be too hot for a large tyrannosaur due to them trapping heat, and T-Rex's environment being too hot and humid for feathers. Again, this statement shows a lack of knowledge on the function of feathers, habitat of T-Rex, and anatomy of a dinosaur. Exhibit A. Hell Creek, T-Rex's environment had a mean annual temperature of 7 to 11 degrees Celsius, or 44 to 52 degrees Fahrenheit, which is neither particularly warm nor warmer than the 10 degrees Celsius of the Yangtze, where the giant feathered Tyrannosaurus lived. Exhibit B. Feathers do much more than just trap heat. A large amount of feathers actually thermoregulates a dinosaur better than fur on mammals. Keep in mind, T-Rex possess stage 3 feathers. Stage 3 feathers are often found in terrestrial birds living in extremely arid and hot environments, much hotter than T-Rex's own, such as ostriches and emus. And these dinosaurs possess a large amount of them, yet still survive. Well, that is because feathers, particularly the type seen in Tyrannosaurs, actually do an amazing job of thermoregulation, or the shedding of heat. This paper compares the plumage of emus to the fur coat of a red kangaroo, living in the same very hot environment, and found that the emu's denser, darker feather covering was superior to the kangaroo's coat in reflecting heat. Emus were active in the heat of the day while kangaroos sought shade. Denser feathers actually does a better job of reflecting heat than less feathers, unlike hair or fur. That is why emus, ostriches, cassowaries, and other large terrestrial birds that live in extremely hot and arid environments have such a large amount of feathers, because they actually help radiate the heat. Hair and feathers are not the same thing. Ostriches, emus, cassowaries, roadrunners all live in environments more arid and hotter than T-Rex's, and their feathers actually help them survive by shedding and reflecting heat. Do I even need to bring up the elephant bird, which were once again dinosaurs the size of hippos and lived on the scorching island of Madagascar, much hotter than Hell Creek? Yet, were almost completely feathered? I don't think I do. It also should be strongly noted that Andrew Cow calculated that a 6-ton Tyrannosaur would generate around the same amount of heat as a 1-ton mammal, while having 5 times the surface area of a 2-ton elephant. This is also without taking into account the dinosaur's air sacs, which would allow far more rapid shedding of excess heat than is possible for a comparable sized mammal. The respiratory systems of dinosaurs is unique, and allows heat to be shed also through the lungs, which would further aid in thermoregulation. The recent T-Rex autopsy documentary has a wonderful clip explaining the dinosaur respiratory system. Feathers would definitely not be too hot for T-Rex. Feathers would actually aid in regulating heat and cool off the animal. Myth 3. Yeah, but elephants. It's important to stress how bad of a comparison elephants and other large-bodied mammals are to large dinosaurs such as T-Rex. So often I hear people comparing the two as if they were similar at all. The most they are common in is in size. I often see many people using elephants' superficial lack of hair to suggest that T-Rex and other large dinosaurs would have overheated if they were covered in feathers. This is a poor analogy to make because elephants are quite hairy and utilize their hair to keep cool, and they're hot, much more so than calculated for Hell Creek environments. Again, feathers and hair have very different thermoregulatory properties. Studies between the thermoregulatory properties of kangaroo and emus living in similar environments yield that the large amount of stage 3 feathers seen in emus actually do a better job reflecting the heat than fur of kangaroos. Feathers do a better job reflecting heat than mammalian fur. Elephants are also semi-aquatic animals. Yup, unlike T-Rex, they spend extended periods of their time in the water, and their ancestors are believed to be semi-aquatic, resulting in the reduction of hair. T-Rex, on the other hand, was far from semi-aquatic. And lastly, probably the best reason why we shouldn't use elephants as a comparison to T-Rex, while herbivores such as elephants must utilize fermentation, which creates heat to digest plant material, carnivores, like T-Rex, would not. Herbivores generate more heat than carnivores, that's just a fact. Using them as a comparison to T-Rex is a very poor one. We should really use something like an elephant bird, or more large terrestrial birds like an emu, ostrich, cassowary, or even just a large predatory mammal. Definitely not elephants or rhinos or hippos. Babies only. And probably the most famous myth I've seen, the baseless statement that only baby Rexes had feathers and all these feathers molted. Although not impossible nor inaccurate, the statement is entirely baseless and not supported by any evidence whatsoever. The important thing to note here is all feathers, which isn't impossible, but it's very unlikely. It is highly probable T-Rex growth was similar to an ostrich, having a large amount of plumage as a juvenile and then molted sections when they grew up. But the thing is, no living dinosaur completely loses all its plumage. Nick's hunch is that the source of this meme is in the documentary T-Rex Walks Again. This is Mark Noel saying we would predict based on information available at the time, not a peer-reviewed paper. Tyrannosaurus essentially strongly argues against the assumption that feathers would be lost in an animal the size of Jane, a subadult T-Rex, for example. Tyrannosaurus' environment wasn't much different than T-Rex's in temperature, so really there isn't a reason to believe it would be much different. So baby feathered T-Rexes that molt all their feathers at an early stage, only leaving naked ostrich-like skin to maturity, isn't supported by any evidence and actually goes against what Tyrannosaurus tells us. I do find it likely they lost some when they reached maturity, leaving naked skin parts that helped radiate heat, again similar to an ostrich, but I doubt they lost all of them. Because A, we have zero evidence to support that, and B, no living dinosaur loses all its plumage. Finale. So in conclusion, the final consensus on if T-Rex was feathered is yes, simply based on phylogenetic bracketing. The extent to which it was feathered is a mystery. It could have been feathered almost completely, or it could have been close to featherless. We know sections like the tail and feet were indeed scaly, as is the case in most dinosaurs. T-Rex would possess stage 2 and stage 3 feathers. And no, it wasn't too big, it wasn't too hot, and it wasn't only for babies. So, an accurate T-Rex is no longer fully scaly, but somewhere between these two extremes, naked and featherless to an almost entirely feathered guy. Most likely, based on related species, it was feathered on its midsections, arms, neck, and back, scaly on its tail, and probably had naked legs with scaly feet. The Saurian team's T-Rex is an excellent example of finding a middle ground between the two limits. This is accurate, and this is accurate. So get out there and tell me what you think T-Rex look like between these two extremes. Thanks for watching. Hello you guys, this is Trey again. I don't want to make this video too long, so I'll keep this short here. I just want to thank all you guys for watching my videos, submitting fan art, and subscribing. I can't tell you how grateful I am. And I just want to personally thank all of you for helping me on my journey as a YouTuber. It has just made me so happy, and I just can't tell you how much this YouTube has changed me as a person. Expect many more memories in the future, and just thank you for your love. See ya next time.